And it gives me great pleasure to welcome César Rodríguez Garavito. This summer, I was reading Rob McFarlane's new book, Is a River Alive?, which is about the rights of nature, but in a very Rob McFarlane way, of deep experiential discussions. And a key feature of it, the first third of the book, is his journey through the cloud forest in the company of César, who describes the story of the Los Cedros cloud forest and how it pioneered the idea of a forest having rights and a river having rights. And so I felt like I already knew before I met you, César, through that book. And I recommend that book because it's thoroughly invigorating. And then last week, we had a workshop in Whiteton Woods. So several of us were camping in the woods, looking at how to redesign the financial system around nature as a core value. So it was a real bonus to have César here. So I'm very excited to be able to also invite him to come and give a seminar to us today. And César is Professor of Law and Chair of the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at NYU School of Law, and founding director of the Earth Rights Research and Action Clinic and the More Than Human Life MOTH program, which we'll hear more about in this seminar. And he's been a real pioneer, a scholar in this area of the rights of nature and how to, beyond just the conceptual ideas, how practically the rights of nature can be implemented as a way of protecting a living world. So thank you for joining us, César.
Thank you, Yadvinder. Thanks everyone for making it today. Thanks, Kate and David and all of you who were there for the retreat last week. I had a great time in that retreat. It was very cold for my taste, but the camping, I should have been prepared for that. But I still enjoyed it hugely. And one thing that I really enjoyed about it was the interdisciplinarity of the conversation and the action-oriented nature of the conversation, which did not compromise, which basically, without compromising the intellectual and the scholarly rigor of the conversation. And that is actually a good way to start with the talk that I have for you, which is really kind of highly participatory. I'm happy to go deep into any of the ideas or any of the actions. As Advito says, the MOTH project, the More Than Human Life project, is a hybrid project that does research, but also creates knowledge in the context of doing things in the world. I'm a pragmatist by disposition, both philosophically and practically. So we learn by doing. And we've launched a bunch of ideas and a bunch of experiments out in the world, some of which I'm going to share with you. But the experiments are done in the spirit of learning and iterating. So these are evolving experiments that I would be very interested in hearing your thoughts about. But I thought I would start with a little bit of a background story to the MOTH idea and how this collective has been around for 3 years now, but it really draws on many years of work in other fields. So I'm going to start with what's most publicly known about this field of knowledge and practice, and then I'll give you the background story, and then finally I'll share some of the work of the MOTH collective. So this is what is known best, the fact that there are many and there's a growing number of initiatives to protect ecosystems, species, individual non-human animals as subjects of rights. So these are all numbers from the Eco-Jurisprudence Monitor. It's a great database that tracks the evolution of these sort of initiatives. And what's represented here is everything from the Declaration on the Rights of Nature that some states at the UN level, starting with Bolivia about 10 years ago, started to push forward in the Harmony for Nature initiative, to the Constitutional Court of Ecuador ruling on the Los Cedros forest that Jan Wiener mentioned, that I'm going to go deeper into later today. So rulings, declarations, pieces of legislation, like the ones protecting some ecosystems in New Zealand, the Wanganui River, the Te Urewera forest, and so on. And then more recently, declarations at the municipal level in places in countries ranging from the US to Spain and beyond. So this is what's called the rights of nature field, or the rights of nature movement. which got a huge boost, if you're a lawyer, from a recent decision by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in July of this year. Some of you may have seen that the International Court of Justice in The Hague and the Inter-American Court of Justice in San Jose, Costa Rica, were asked to give their opinion, their kind of their authoritative opinions on the relationship between climate change and human rights. So two different courts, both highly regarded, and one of them, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, came down with a 250-page decision that includes around 10 pages on rights of nature. This was not necessarily kind of the core of the questions that were asked to the court in the advisory opinion, but because Latin American constitutionalism had been working with this idea for a while, it started with 2008, the 2008 Ecuadorian constitution that enshrined the rights of nature in its positive law. The Inter-American Court did what I think it should have done. I pleaded before the court, and so did many other scholars and practitioners. And the court said, well, the status quo of the law in this part of the world is such that we, as the Inter-American Court, can go on and say that non-human entities of the organic type, not AIs, but animals and rivers and forests, can be plausibly understood as subjects of rights as opposed to objects of rights, right? So rights of nature now has this kind of authoritative source, but it wasn't like that for 20 years. And I'm gonna end with a quote by William James that I wanna give you too much too much kind of the content beforehand, but the quote will point in the direction of how these ideas seem unlikely at the beginning. I was there early enough to have been the object of skepticism for this type of ideas. So were indigenous peoples for decades or hundreds of years, who had said that it's not only humans, but also non-humans that should be included in the circle of moral and legal concern. Now everyone wants to get on this bandwagon, as it happens, you know, when things become more mainstream, there's a lot more interest. But this is all for the better, because there is a momentum around this idea, not only in Latin America, but also elsewhere. I'm happy to go into cases, into where this is happening, but this is the shape of the field, of the evolution of the cases in the field. Now, I'm going to step back from this and share some thoughts about the philosophical, the legal, and the cultural components of this movement that I understand as being more as being broader than just the rights of nature legal initiatives. And to do that, one has to go back to the human rights movement. So I came to rights of nature work from a human rights and indigenous rights angle. I used to be a full-time carrying member of the human rights community. I would teach human rights classes in law schools, and I would practice law in tricky places like Colombia or South Africa or India and elsewhere. And it was in the context of working with indigenous peoples of the Amazon, specifically the Sarayaku people of the Ecuadorian Amazon, that I stumbled upon the idea of rights of nature. So everything that, this is why chapter 1, as Jadvin said, of Rob McFarlane's book is so helpful, because it's a combination of kind of the celebration of the aliveness of rivers and nature, but also a socio-legal story of how that awareness got woven into the legal mainstream at the initiative of indigenous peoples in Ecuador and elsewhere in constitutions, in pieces of legislation, and so on. So first time I hear about rights of nature, 2012 in Ecuador, working with the Sarayaku indigenous people. I have an interview, and perhaps this is the moment. I was a little bit younger back then. And this is Don Sabino, the shaman of the Sarayaku community. He was around 95. At the time, he lived to be 103. And I was there because I was asked to help with the implementation of a major court ruling that they had gotten from the same court that I mentioned earlier, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. That is the main precedent international indigenous rights law that protects the rights of indigenous peoples to be consulted before any legislative initiative or any economic project goes forward in their territories. This is FPIC, free, prior, and informed consultation and consent. I was not interested. I had no. I was not there to work on the rights of the river Bobonasa or the trees in the background or the mountains. But when I talked to Don Sabino and other members of the community, all they kept talking about was the need to consult also with the spirits of the forest. And this conversation was all about the forest being alive, there being life in the river, in the little critters on the ground, and the trees and everything around us. Back then, I had no intellectual or practical tools to make anything of this kind of practically, but over time, it became clear to me that, and this is something that in this setting needs no explanation, so I'm gonna breeze through these slides here, that human rights in general, as a field, was unprepared to entertain this sort of question, right? As much as the human rights project needs to be defended, especially these days, clearly human rights is a creature of its time. We recently celebrated the 75th anniversary of the UN Declaration on Human Rights, 1948. There's nothing in that declaration about the environment. That was not the preoccupation of the time. That was before planetary boundaries in Western science and all of that. So human rights very much partakes the spirit and the legal rules and the intellectual tools of the Anthropocene, right? So the great acceleration, those 75 years are also the time of the population growth, pollution, pesticide use of plastics, and so on. And that is also the time of human rights. That doesn't mean that the great acceleration and environmental destruction, the triple planetary crisis of pollution, climate, biodiversity loss was caused by human rights, but there's definitely an overlap. And the interesting thing is that as the ecological emergencies became more and more evident, the conversation and the discussion internally in the human rights field began to shift slowly but surely. Initially, by the way, human rights actors, and I lived this kind of in my professional life, were very skeptical about using human rights tools to deal with things like the climate emergency. A book I published very recently is the 20-year history of the idea of framing the climate emergency as a human rights emergency. It takes stock of 500 legal cases around the world that have done just that. And again, all kinds of organizations are filing their own case these days, but 20 years ago, when the Inuit indigenous leader of Alaska, Sheila Cloutier, worked with lawyers at Earth Justice to file their first such case, they were met with derision. They said, like, what do you mean? This is an environmental issue. This is not a human rights issue. They went to organizations like the big ones around the NGOs, the human rights NGOs, and they got the cold shoulder. I have the quotes in my book where they say, well, if you add climate to the mix of human rights preoccupations, then you will kind of dilute the human rights message. Human rights is about prisoners of conscience, people who cannot express their views freely, physical integrity, and so on. It's not climate. Luckily, we're in a very different position, and those two opinions by the ICJ and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights are basically they cap a 20-year history. The journalists and many observers are framing these decisions as the kind of the inauguration of a new era. It's actually kind of the capping of 20 years of work of many people who were pioneers in their fields and managed to frame climate change as a human rights issue. Now, what's happening in this currently as a result of that movement and others is that the interesting conversations happening in human rights, well, the conversations in the human rights, the scholarly and practical conversations in the human rights field used to revolve around the rights part of the human rights equation, meaning, do we add socioeconomic rights, right? There was a 10-year debate where Human Rights Watch came out aggressively against the idea of adding right to housing, right to health, right to food as human rights, again with the idea that this is that doing so would dilute the message of the protection of the real human rights, which according to that old-fashioned and defeated view were civil and political rights. But that's where all the energy was in determining what counted as a right. To come back to rights of nature, the ongoing debates, both intellectually and practically these days, have to do with the other word in this sentence, with the human in human rights, meaning who is to be considered a rights holder? Right? Do we include animals, non-human animals? If we include non-human animals, as the animal rights movement has been advocating for 50 years now, we recently celebrated the 50th anniversary of Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation. Well, does it mean that we can further expand the circle of legal concern and protection to plants? Then we have scientists like Monica Gagliano showing us that plants have memory and that they can hear and they can emit sounds, and that they're sentient. So does that mean that if sentience is the gold standard of moral consideration, do we also bring in trees, right? But then if you say this, and you say, well, okay, let's count in plants and animals, you'll have then the mycologists who are a very kind of raucous group. And the MOTH collective was born partly out of my engagement with mycologists like Merlin Sheldrick and Juliana Furci. They will not, and the first initiative that we launched, even before MOTH was established as such, was the 3F initiative. And it's called 3Fs because it's supposed to bring in fungi as the third kingdom of life to the level of protection, environmental protection that fauna and flora enjoy, right? So they will not have any patience with the circle of moral concern, including only animals and plants, right? I'm not going to have time to go into ongoing debates that are making all of this murkier and more complicated, but I'm going to point in that direction because I'm now starting to get involved in those debates. Some of you may have seen that there are some scholars and organizations now advocating for AI rights, right? The rights of non-human synthetic entities. I just want to say that the MOTH collective is not about that I get emails every week asking me whether the More Than Human collective is about AI rights, and I say, no, really, like we're in the business of helping engage with organic life. And I've been in one of those email threads. One of the responses that I got when I said that is, well, you're so biocentric. And I said, yes, yeah, I'll take that. Yeah, I'll take that. I'm for life. Yes, yes. But that's just to say that because of those two very different trends, like rights of nature and potential rights of AI synthetic entities, this is where the action is. Both, so we're looking for interesting dissertation projects on anything having to do with human rights. I would advise not to go down this route, but to go down this route and help us elucidate what needs to be done to reframe the category of a rights holder. Now, why do I speak about and have written about, by the way, some of these ideas are elaborated, are explained in further detail in a book that we put together that is called just that, More Than Human Rights. And many of the MOTH collective members wrote chapters of that book. Rob did, McFarlane, Marilyn has a fantastic conversation with David Abram. David Abram wrote a great epilogue about more than human in the legal field and so on. But the reason why, briefly, why I prefer to talk about more than human rights is because the rights of nature terminology, which I also use, like I'm enough of a practitioner not to get bogged down in terminological debates. But in this setting, I'm happy to talk about this terminology. I'm taking, of course, the more than human a bit from David Abram's work. And the reason why I find that framework was so compelling is because it forces us to use categories that are all about interrelation. Nature, rights of nature, and let alone the rights of the right to a healthy environment, kind of point in the direction of the duality, the difference between humanity and nature, between nature and culture, humans and their environment, which is the environmental movement of the 1970s and beyond. This deep ecology understanding of rights means that human rights are seen as embedded in more than human rights, in the rights of the more than human world. So it's not that we are, from this point of view, epistemologically and practically, extending the rights of humans to the more than human world, but that human rights cannot be conceived, let alone protected, without at the same time protecting the rights of the more than human world. In this crowd, I think because we have a bunch of ecologists here, that the existence of the biosphere and the betterness of human beings in the biosphere goes without saying, but this is not the case in mainstream circles, even in human rights conversation. So that's what the terminology is meant to do. Now, after the book, and as we've moved forward in the experiments in the MOTH collective, I've come to like this terminology also because I want to emphasize that this is about more than rights. So the rights terminology can be also very constraining, right? So sometimes it doesn't make any sense. By the way, indigenous peoples like the Sarayaku, the terminology that they use more organically and immediately is not a terminology of rights, although they're very skillful lawyers and they will use the rights of nature legal and conceptual apparatus. But there are words, terms, values that cannot be easily squeezed into the rights terminology, like reciprocity, like responsibility. So what I aim to do with the colleagues in the More Than Human Life Collective is to help build out a legal grammar of animacy. And I'm taking the grammar of animacy idea from Robin Wall Kimmerer's work. So, because law, in addition to being a powerful instrument of social ordering and social change, it is a very powerful storytelling tool. And I think that one of the things that has fascinated me about working in this space very kind of intensively for the last 3 years is that the idea of rights of nature resonates with so many people, especially if you work on the rights of charismatic non-humans like whales. People immediately kind of are moved by that intuition, right? Yeah. So how do we protect the rights of sperm whales? I'll give you in closing a little video of sperm whales, which is one of the actions that we're undertaking. But I think that the fascination has to do, yes, with the possibility of protecting the forest that you love, the river that you were born by, the animal that you most care about, but mostly because the More Than Human Rights story, it's a story that brings in the grammar of animacy very vividly, and that because law is a very special form of storytelling, law has performative value, right? If you look at this window and say, well, that river, you're a poet and you write the most beautiful poem about these trees, that would probably inspire many people to protect those trees. But if you're a judge and you look at the window and you say those trees are rights holders, or they have rights that need to be protected, like the Constitutional Court of Ecuador said with the trees of Los Cedros Forest, then that gives you traction potentially on the ground. Then you can, as the activists in Ecuador and the judges in Ecuador did, you can push out the mining companies, which is what's happened, right? So it's that performative, this kind of magical aspect to legal storytelling that I think captivates and kind of attracts so many people to the idea of rights of nature, or as I prefer to call it, more than human rights. I'm gonna have to go forward more quickly because I do wanna leave time for questions and comments. I'm gonna skip through most of this just to remind people that etymologically, one thing that I went to a Jesuit school, so I did a lot of Latin, but I like etymology not because of that, but because that there are animistic, a lot of animistic elements to the roots of Western languages, right? Because it's not like the West was always this materialist. So one of the things that I like about this idea of working with the etymology of human in human rights is that human comes, as some of you may know, from the same root as humus, as humbling, as humility, and literally as soil. So literally human rights mean earthlings' rights. And that's how love for human rights activists and scholars to come together and have a more of a generative conversation with environmental lawyers, with ecologists, with folks concentrating on the more than human. One thing that I feel very strongly about and that we have tried to cultivate in the MOTH Collective is bringing together Western and indigenous sciences, right? These two modes of understanding the more than human world. This is possible these days. Again, in this group, this will be readily understandable. The quote unquote hard sciences, some sectors of hard sciences are kind of becoming more porous to these conversations, and not just ecologists. We've worked with marine biologists, with mycologists already mentioned, botanists. We're working with physicists now who are very comfortable with the taking down of the categorical distinction between humans and non-humans. Can say more about that. And at the same time, we want to see what can happen at the intersection or in dialogue with indigenous knowledges. I'll give you one specific example. The MOTH Collective organizes an annual gathering in places like the Witham Woods. Last year, we did it in the Amazon forest, in the middle of the Ecuadorian Amazon forest. And 1 week before the collective members came together, we did an intercultural scientific expedition between mycologists, Toby Kears from the Society for the Protection of Underground Networks, Merlin Sheldrake, Juliana Fulci from the Fungi Foundation, and the knowledge keepers of the Sariaku community who have mapped out both the above ground biodiversity and who have a deep understanding of the underground richness of the forest. And we spent 1 week using both types of tools. SPAN would use their sampling techniques that then they use for eDNA analysis to understand the biodiversity of the underground. And the indigenous scientists would tell the stories of what their knowledge and their wisdom about the forest says about those points of where we were sampling for soil. A documentary about this interscientific expedition is coming out next week during Climate Week, and it'll be available in on the MOTH's website. The next experiment of this sort will revolve around whales. We've been working with Project CETI, C-E-T-I, the Cetaceans Translation Initiative, which is the scientific collective but is farthest along in understanding the complexity and potentially the content of sperm whale communication. And because of our work with indigenous peoples, we had been in touch with indigenous leaders of the Pacific Islands, especially New Zealand. Some of them drafted and then published a fantastic Rights of Whales Declaration. And the Pacific Island indigenous people are the ones who have been in communication with whales for the longest time. You know, if you've read about the traditional wayfinding that they used to navigate the oceans, way before Europeans were able to navigate the open oceans. While the Polynesian indigenous people were navigating the open oceans, Europeans at the time were hugging the coast because they didn't know how to navigate in the open oceans. One of the ways in which the wayfinders of the Pacific did what they did, if you've seen the movie Moana, you'll kind of that type of thing, is by understanding and by observing closely the migratory patterns of cetaceans, right? And also the winds and the stars and so on. So now we're doing a similar expedition to New Zealand with this Project SETI scientists and the Maori leaders to see how that intercultural exchange gives us ideas for the legal protection of whales in that huge chunk of Earth, the former Polynesian Triangle between New Zealand, Hawaii, and Easter Island in Latin America. I'm going to skip to the end here and open it up, but I didn't want to skip this part because, of course, this has, some of you may be familiar with this little diagram here. And I didn't make this up for this presentation. It's actually in my chapter in the MOTH book. I used Kate's idea of the donut and adapted it, and this was before the MOTH book. I wrote another chapter for an Oxford handbook on human rights for the and climate change. And to put it in terms of I don't have to rehearse all of this, but the part that I want to add here is that I see, and I think, Kate, you'll tell me if this is correct, but the social foundations part and the protection of all these entitlements and good things for life can be seen as something that the Human Rights Project aspired to, right? There's certainly the right to housing, the right to water, right to food, and so on, in addition to the right to political voice. So these are basically civil, political, and socioeconomic rights. But one would, a government, all governments of the world, if they had put their act together, would have potentially been able to protect all of these and realize all of these rights, basically fully implement all the human rights declarations and treaties of the second half of the 20th century, and still destroy the planet in the process of doing that, right? Because human rights, again, just like the other fields of knowledge and practice that we're familiar with from the last century, we're not concerned with limits, with planetary boundaries, right? So one way to bring together the donut with more than human rights or rights of nature is to understand that what many human rights courts and practitioners and scholars are doing is kind of flesh out in legal terms this outer ring, so the ecological ceiling, by granting entitlements, by granting legal protections to forests, to rivers, to the climate system, and so on. I'm happy to come back to this, but I need to close. So I'll close with the more kind of action-oriented aspect of MOTH's work. And I'm going to give you 2 examples. I don't have time for 3 examples. So One has to do with what Yadvinder kindly shared about Rob McFarlane's book. So we were in this forest in the cloud forest of Ecuador. This is Los Cedros. 2021, the Constitutional Court of Ecuador hears a case that was filed by a collective of scientists who had spent time in Los Cedros documenting its biodiversity. This is one, because this is also a scientific station. It had been kind of widely documented by various scientists spending time in that forest. But then also the local communities and then environmental advocates. They all went to the Constitutional Court as a last resort because the movement had, the government had just approved mining exploration for copper and gold, I think, in the forest. So what they decided to do is use the language of in 2008 Ecuadorian constitution that says that just as humans have a right to a healthy environment, nature itself has a right to flourishing and to survival. And they got, this is, if anyone is interested in rights of nature jurisprudence, I think that the 2021 decision by the Ecuadorian Constitutional Court is the most sophisticated one in that genre. It also has a fantastic biological kind of, I think it will please biologists among you because it's also quite skillful in summarizing all the biological evidence that was submitted to the court. And it declared the Los Cedros forest as a subject of rights and banned mining in Los Cedros. This is where when the MOTH collective got involved, because one of the things that we do is try to help protect the ecosystems or the non-humans that are protected by rights of nature, judicial decisions, or pieces of legislation, because sometimes you win a case and then the government waits until the tension fades and then continues to do business as usual. So we've been in the forest several times already. We're quite actively working with the local advocates and the scientists. But in 2022, Rob Cosmo Sheldrick, a musician that you may know about that does music with the Sounds of Nature, among other sources of inspiration, and Julie Furchi, an ecologist who's also part of the MOTH collective. We went to the forest, we hiked the forest for 10 days. And this is what became the material for Rob's first chapter in the book. And while we were there in the high forest, I don't know if some of you have met Rob. Rob is a magician with words. I mean, he really, as we were hiking in the forest, this guy would talk in like in fully formed paragraphs. This is like, as I told him, but this is, you just have to basically download the recording from this thing and have an AI transcribe it. And then this is a first draft of a book. That's how he talks. And that's how he also composes lyrics. So high up, we were hadn't showered for a week or so, up there in the high camp. He started scribbling some notes. And there were lyrics for a song, and he showed that to us by the fire, and Cosmo starts making music with it. Cosmo put music to those lyrics that night. Julie and I added some words in Spanish here and there, and a song was born that is available on Spotify, anywhere. It's called The Song of the Cedars.
Trees, speak in your leaves, breeze and streams, tell me your dreams. Trees, speak in your leaves, breeze and streams, tell me your dreams. Trees, speak in your leaves, breeze and streams, tell me your dreams. Trees, speak in your leaves, breeze and streams, tell me your dreams. Birds, sing me your rhymes, please, and stones, teach teach me your time. Birds, sing me your rhymes, please, and stones, teach me your time. Birds, sing me your rhymes, please, and stones, teach me your time. Birds, sing me your rhymes, please, and stones.
Like the trees, the cedars, Song of Cedars. And I suggested that we run a legal experiment with it, right? That we push the boundaries of what's possible within existing copyright law by asking the copyright authorities of Ecuador to recognize what was very evident to all of us, that the forest had co-created the song. And so if you listen to the music, it's mostly the sounds of bats that Cosmo recorded with special equipment in the forest, sounds of the toucan barbets, the howling monkeys, the hummingbirds, and so on. And then, of course, he does add this beautiful music to it, and the lyrics are all mostly what Rob had written down in the forest. So we went ahead. This is what the MOTH Collective does. So we went ahead and worked with Ecuadorian specialists, lawyers, and we filed a petition to the Copyright Authority that is ongoing to have the Song of the Cedars recognized as a co-creation, as having been co-authored by the song. So it's 4 humans and 1 non-human, the forest. And since the forest had been acknowledged, recognized by the Constitutional Court as a subject of rights, what we're doing is, well, let's extract the legal and the legal and the logical consequences from that sort of legal recognition. I can give you more details of the case because it's been going forward. We ultimately think that the Copyright Authority will see this as too woo-woo, or too risky for them to acknowledge, but we're prepared to go all the way to the court. So we would sue the Copyright Authority and go to the court and say, well, let's get serious about the legal consequences of rights of nature, and will you consider protecting this entity as co-creator of this song? Regardless of what happens in the court of law, this initiative has made ripples in the court of public opinion. And that is partly what we're after, right? So the law can also be a powerful source of cultural change. And one thing that I've learned, having worked on human rights and indigenous rights, and more recently climate change action, is that unless one does their best to impact culture, like cultural dispositions, what people care about, what they love, what they feel moved by, the chance of actually changing institutions and changing the laws is slim. So we're, as Rob said, we've been swimming upstream from rights to life. And this is why we renamed the collective as More Than Human Life. It's not, so we still have the More Than Human Rights line of work, but now the collective is called More Than Human Life. Finally, I'll leave you with these other very different features. These are sperm whales of the Caribbean. So this is all from Project SETI's science, and this is one of the other experiments that we've been running. SETI has published kind of the cutting edge papers on the complexity of the language of sperm whales. So no one has yet understood what they're saying. No one has understood what elephants are saying, although in this crowd, there's always kind of an elephant specialist and a hyena specialist, and because scientists claim, like the head scientist of Project SETI for this project has been working with these sperm whales for 15 years. He can recognize them from afar, just from little stripe on the back of a whale. So there are many things that can be understood about animal communication without AI. Now, Project SETI is using some AI tools and really cutting edge robotics to record gently and non-invasively the sounds and the communications of whales. And they've gotten as far as to establishing that the sperm whales have the equivalent in their language to vowels, diphthongs, and tones like in Mandarin. So the building blocks of a highly complex combinatorial language. That is widely available. They published it in Nature Communications. So our partnership for the last 2.5 years has been about extracting the legal and consequences from that science and saying, look, the objections to animal rights were initially, well, about animals not being sentient, right? But that was taken care of a long time ago. Then the bar got raised to, well, but they're not intelligent, but then they're shown to solve all kinds of problems. And then the bar got raised to consciousness, and then you have, but they're intelligent, but they're not aware of their lives. And then you have the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness last year that was endorsed by the foremost consciousness scholars of the world. And then, of course, the bar gets raised to the point of, okay, they may be all of that, but surely they can't speak, right? So the intriguing, fascinating prospect is what if, right? What if? So the paper we're publishing 1st of October in Ecology Law Quarterly, which is a major environmental law journal. The title is, what if we understood what animals are saying? What would be the legal and ethical consequences of that? That's work that we're doing with Project SETI, and we're also working separately as MOTH, although in conversation with SETI and others, on legal and ethical guardrails for this type of research, because this comes with many risks, right? Imagine what it can be done if poachers got wind of a technology to communicate with elephants, or whale watching operations, or were able to lure whales to their boats and so on. For now, we're working, so that is also something that we're publishing soon. But for now, to stay with a more positive story, we're arguing in the paper with Project SETI that arguments and cases and legal actions that would have been seen as preposterous only a few years ago now can be seriously pursued. For instance, and I'll leave you with that and I'll close here. If you Google Project SETI, New Yorker, they were featured by the New Yorker, and the New Yorker tells a story of something that of an event that the journalist from the New Yorker, Liz Colbert, witnessed while she was covering this, the Project SETI's work in the Caribbean for this story. So what they were able to record is the first kind of thoroughly recorded birth event of a whale pod for Western science. And since then, Project SETI has been doing all kinds of network analysis, who did what, and what they're showing is that it's a highly, highly collaborative event where females that are related to each other take turns in doing certain things during the birth event. And then it's an interspecies event because another species was basically doing a kind of a protective ring around the sperm whales. So it's a spectacular demonstration of the sociability, the collaborative nature of whale relationships. And so we're advancing the argument, two arguments. One is that ship traffic, deep sea mining, that those are forms of torture to whales because they're highly auditory animals. They're almost blind, but they're keen listeners. So as another scientist put it, like a deaf whale is a dead whale, right? So the masking of their voices, the interference, constant interference with their voices is the equivalent of like flashing light straight into a human's eyes, right? Because we're highly visual, they're highly auditory. So we're saying, like, look, now we have this evidence. You can say you can pursue legal actions that protect whales from torture, and likewise, that whales have a right to culture. They're highly sociable individuals and species. They live in cultures. So the right to live in a pod, to retain their social roles and norms is crucial to their survival, right? This last point is highly provocative, right? Because culture is supposed to be something that only humans do. Not all anthropologists are happy with the extension of culture to non-humans, and definitely there hasn't been any legal case that protects the collective rights of a species of this sort. So that is what we're doing now. Okay, I clearly took much longer than I had planned, but I hope that this gives you a flavor for what we're doing. Predictably very difficult questions. The good thing is that I don't have to solve them, really, because this is this is an open-ended research program, and where I am personally very happy to coexist with different views, say, to begin with the first question of individual versus ecosystemic protection. That is something that has been very alive in animal rights circles. One thing that I'm amused by is how some animal rights scholars and practitioners get very uncomfortable with talk about rights of nature, right? And the reason why I'm amused, not because I want to, they've been doing fantastic work for 50 years now, but it's interesting when a field that's been trying to open new spaces for other species becomes kind of the gatekeepers to the further expansion of that boundary. And if you ask people like Monica Gagliano or Marilyn Sheldrake, from a scientific point of view, the categorical distinction between animals and plants, for instance, is untenable, right? Not that they're all the same, but there's much more fluidity across those boundaries than there is categorical separation, right? Just like animal rights thinkers and doers have been saying about the categorical distinction between, or against the categorical distinction between human animals and non-human animals. Now, having said that, in practice, in the rights of nature field, this is a nascent field, so there's less conceptual work that's been done than, say, in the 50 years of the tradition of animal rights. So this is, for example, one thing that I think can be very generative. We're doing some of that work, but we're not interested in policing the boundaries, right? So we're mapping the different stances in the rights of nature field. So you will find people who think that unless you have an ecocentric, an ecosystemic focus, then you will end up doing things like protecting the whales to the detriment of other forms of life in the oceans, right? So why be whale-centric, right? So in the guardrails that we're about to publish as MOTH, the guardrails for AI-assisted animal communication studies, we adopt an ecocentric view that pays attention to the well-being, not just of whales, but of the surrounding non-human and human communities. One other potential downside to the focus on one species of animals is that non-humans, the rights of humans and the well-being of humans kind of is put in the kind of in the back, kind of is given secondary importance. So if you ask me if you absolutely needing an answer from me about my inclination, my inclination is to protect ecosystems as opposed to only one charismatic species or one, let alone one individual. But I think that because it's early in the development of this field, that there is no way that anyone can police this, and that we'll learn as we go. And some cases and some litigation goes forward, as it has gone forward in countries like Argentina, or even in New York State. You may have read that a case on the right of Happy the elephant, rights of Happy the elephant in the Bronx Zoo to be freed from his cage in the Bronx Zoo. Oh, well, it lost. The organization litigating the case lost, but it was a split decision, 2-1, which in the U.S. is almost miraculous, right? Because this is not exactly a moment for legal creativity in the U.S. as you all know. But but in other jurisdictions like Argentina, with chimps, and also another case in Ecuador. In other cases, in other jurisdictions, however, like Spain, the Mar Menor, a whole lagoon system was protected as a subject of rights, not by a court, but by parliament, actually. And then the Constitutional Court reviewed a legal challenge against that piece of legislation from parliament and said, yes, an evolving understanding of human rights in the Constitution would include protection of non-human entities like a lagoon. So pretty expansive understanding of the Constitution right there. In New Zealand, it's been mostly ecosystems, rivers, forests. So there's everything in between. Quickly on the other question, so yes, so you have been there on animals and violence and interspecies violence and so on. Like I think that one thing that is good about law, including human rights law, is that lawyers are very comfortable with what's called like balancing tests, balancing reasoning along the lines of how do we balance out different considerations. Like there's no absolute right to free speech. There's no absolute right to food, because you have to insert the protection of that right in the context of other important legal and moral and political considerations, right? So I'm not an animal law expert, so I don't know exactly how courts have dealt with this. For me, this is animals being animals, and if you're protecting their flourishing as individuals and as species, it would be, to my mind, quite odd to come in with an anthropocentric understanding of the right to life and send a lion to jail because it ate some creature in the savannah, right? But then non-human property, yes, this is a big question that's bubbling up very powerfully. I won't have time to give you kind of specific details. There's Karen Bradshaw, a scholar at the University of Arizona, has done really good work about this, the right to property of non-humans. And the good thing is that there are precedents in Western law, like the rights of corporations to own property, that you can leverage. You can say, well, corporations are not human entities. They're definitely not individuals. They're definitely not made of flesh and blood. And yet we've found fictitious ways, right? So imaginative ways to have them own property. So one line of work and practice that I'm encouraged by is, imaginative lawyers that are thinking about questions like this. If some people who are inspired by this movement would like to donate a piece of land, but they don't want to donate it to a charity, they don't want to donate it to a group of humans, they want the land to own itself. So there are some lawyers thinking about how that could happen, right? For example, through a charter, through a trust. And this is where private lawyers who are not normally engaged in these discussions can be very helpful. So I personally think that is a perfectly logical consequence of rights of nature. And again, I would point you in the direction of Karen Bradshaw's work. And finally, indigenous wisdom and Western traditions of rights of nature. So short answer is yes. Most of the recent impetus and most of the energy in the original kind of the early stages of the rights of nature movement came from indigenous peoples, and they continue to be a main point of a key point of reference. Now, what has happened over the last 30 years or so is that non-indigenous scientists and collectives have kind of tried to recover elements in their cultures and in their knowledge traditions that also have some animistic component or ecocentric component to them. This is what I refer to by giving you the etymology of human. But there are other ways of doing that, not through language only. I would love for the rights of nature, more than human rights field to be intercultural, because putting all the faith and all the bets on indigenous knowledge has two disadvantages. One is that everyone else gets lazy and wait for indigenous people to solve the problem, and they're not exactly in every context in a position to do that because they're fighting other fights. And B, because it misses out on an opportunity to mainstream ecocentric ideas in Western knowledge in ways that I think can be very impactful, right? And so I'm more for dialogue and from cross-learning, as opposed to saying, well, this is indigenous, I won't touch it, because it's more generative and also, I think, more creative. I fully agree with what you said toward the end of your second comment, David, that yes, it should have been always like that. It probably was factually always like that, that human rights could not thrive in a world that was being destroyed. But this is the realization that came to human rights thinkers and doers only 75 years later, right? So the argument here is it's always been like that, but the conceptual and legal apparatus of the field has failed to register that. So the donut comes as a provocation, right? As a provocation, as a friendly amendment, but a major friendly expansion of the framework. I like the circles. Before the Wood and Woods retreat, I was yet another retreat in the woods somewhere else in the UK, and I realized that I didn't talk about the donut, but I realized I was sitting in circles, right? And someone asked, well, how do we bring together these circles, right? The circles of ecocentric spiritual leaders, ecocentric economists, ecocentric lawyers, and so on. And Rilke's poem, Widening Circles, came to my mind as a very helpful way to understand this. I see that diagram, my understanding of the donut in the legal field, as a widening circle, right? So the first line in that poem by Rilke is, I live my life in widened circles, right? That ripple out across the world, and I may not complete this one, and so on. So, but this is, I like the metaphor because it's widening circles, concentric circles still contain the core. It's not like you have taken out the core, but you've expanded the shape and the size and the contours of the resulting wider circle. So that's how I see it. And in that spirit, I'm hoping that while making the layers visible, that the idea of interrelatedness and interdependence is still is visible in the shape of the figure of the circle as such. Then on AI politics, I have a whole other presentation about this because it's that important. So, and I fully agree with you that this is not going away, that those of us who are interested in protecting the rights of organic non-human life need to engage thoughtfully with ideas and actions for the protection of AIs. Now, and there are really good scholars, like philosophers, mostly the people I know best are some philosophers and a few lawyers who are actively creating some sort of dialogue between AI rights and rights of nature that basically start with the assumption that there's got to be or there's got to be some sort of parameter that applies to both forms of life. Say if it's sentience, well, then if AI becomes sentience, then that's the moment where you recognize that those synthetic beings also have rights and so on. I was trained as a lawyer and as a philosopher, but my PhD is in sociology. So I can't help seeing the relations of power, right? And I can't help noticing that the ethical and the existential impulse behind these two movements it's quite different, right? Not to give you the other and the other talk, but my fear with a thoughtless expansion of legal subjectivity to everything non-human is that it's clear that the techno accelerationists of Silicon Valley would like nothing more than recognize the legal rights of AIs as a way to further accelerate the development of that technology, and that the political economy behind that is exactly kind of going in exact opposite direction as the impulse behind most efforts in the rights of nature movement. So basically, one is trying to reconnect us with the more than human world. The other one is trying to take us to Mars, right? So it's that different, right? So while doing, and this is it's tricky because I think that the MOTH Collective is now doing some initial research on AI rights precisely to be able to engage with that field thoughtfully. And our entry point has been the work on AI-assisted animal communication, because we already are working in conversation with some thoughtful people in AI. But at the same time, we want to be very careful about what we say about AI, because we know that the field of the practice is so skewed that any argument for the protection of AI might be gobbled up by Silicon Valley and by techno accelerationists, and that would boost efforts to do what some technology accelerationists have said in their manifestos, that for human beings to be what they are, according to their own writing, the apex predator, and that we are the masters of but we're not afraid of the light. We control the light is the line from one techno-accelerationist manifesto. So couldn't agree more. It's highly complicated, but I think that as we engage with the philosophical arguments, we also need to be very mindful of the political economy of these fields. And finally, on the Amazon, this is where I've spent most of my life, so I know exactly what the challenges to implementation of rights of all kinds, laws of all kinds are. But precisely because of that experience, I'm very comfortable with those complications in that it's equally difficult these days to protect the rights of an indigenous nation in the middle of the Amazon as it is to protect the rights of a river that nation fought for to have recognized as a rights holder. The tools can be pretty much the same. It's not just litigation or legal advocacy, but campaigning, international visibility, and so on. Now, this will come as no consolation, but it's not like the rest of the world is in good shape and that this problem is only about the Amazon or the global South. There are very serious challenges to the implementation and the survival of rights of all kinds in other parts of the world as well. So this is just the work that needs to be done.